And we're live. Everyone, I'm Josh Martin. This is Making America. Let's keep talking. Really excited today to get into the Trump administration, obviously the inauguration for Joe Biden and the 46th president of the United States is tomorrow. But I want to kind of recap what's gone on the last 4 years. You know, when thinking of the Trump administration over the past 4 years, the first words that come to mind are chaotic and dangerous. Particularly for people of color and people in marginalized communities. But as we've come to realize, really for everyone else as well, I'm excited for our conversation today because we have Elizabeth Neumann, a former Trump administration insider, security expert, and one of the verified adults in the room during the administration. Elizabeth, how are you?
I'm good, Josh. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, really excited to learn more about your background. And I think, when first people think, oh, you worked in the Trump administration, one in the news recently, you find that a lot of staffers that worked in the Trump administration are having trouble finding employment. But that's not the case for you, obviously, because you have a long track record in working with multiple administrations as a security expert. Curious just to, how did you become a part of the Trump administration? Maybe we'll start there and kind of track your career to date.
Sure thing. Uh, I'll go backwards about 20 plus years. I was a college student in Austin around the time that a guy named George W. Bush was running for governor for a second time, and had the opportunity to get involved in party politics and participate in that gubernatorial election. Which I was always interested in government. I wasn't quite sure where I was going in college. I think I changed majors at least 8 times. My parents were rather frustrated, thinking I was never going to graduate. But then he ran for president. And my senior year, I worked on the campaign. And those watching may remember, we had this long drawn out recount in Florida, and it took forever to figure out who won the election. But when in mid-December, George W. Bush was announced as president, everybody just kind of moved to DC, and I was still in school. My parents were like, yeah, this is an amazing opportunity. This doesn't come around every day. You should do it, but you have to promise us you'll finish school, which I did. But it was an amazing opportunity to come to Washington and work in a presidential administration. I was, the very classic, fresh out of college, I'm going to change the world perspective. And those early days, I worked in the faith-based and community initiatives, which was kind of a domestic policy angle. But I was really interested in foreign policy. But you definitely have to have a college degree for that, and you really need a master's for that. So my vision was like, I'm going to work a few years and go back to grad school. Well, 9/11 happened, and that really changed the administration's priorities, and it changed our our trajectory. And there was
Rightfully so.
Yeah, right. And there was this opportunity that came up to work at the White House. I've been working in a cabinet agency at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Department of Education. But there was this opportunity to work at the White House itself, which was, again, just like the coolest thing ever
It's a
when
big
you're
deal.
a young staff member. So I took it. It basically was like paralegal type work and answering phones. So it wasn't as intellectually stimulating, but it was still just amazing to be on that campus. Well, it happened that the time that I started working for the counsel's office, we were doing document production for the 9/11 Commission. And what that means is that as pieces of paper that are relevant to the lead up to and the response from 9/11, going over to the commission for their work, the counsel's office had to review every single piece of paper. There's a formal legal process that they had to go through, which included copying and bait stamping, which is like the most boring thing of all. But because I was a part of the counsel's office and asked to do this work, I had to get a security clearance because some
Yes.
of the information
Sensitive
was
documents. Yeah.
About 2 or 3 months went by, and then at some point you start questioning your choices. Like, is this my life? I'm just going to be copying papers for a very long time. And lo and behold, that was around the time that we were standing up the Department of Homeland Security, and a whole bunch of people that worked at the White House were moving up to the new department. Tom Ridge was
Hmm.
becoming secretary, and they needed a new Homeland Security advisor. And he got installed, and they needed an assistant for this Homeland Security advisor, and they needed them quick, and they needed somebody with a security clearance. And there were like three of us on campus.
Hmm.
So I got a call. They were,
Short list.
yeah, they were like, "Hey, you're going to go interview for this." And you're like, "Oh, okay." And I really clicked with the guy that was the Homeland Security advisor. Turns out our families, like his wife and my dad, grew up less than a half mile from each other in the middle of
Perfect.
nowhere, Missouri. So
Yeah.
there was just kind of a connection there, and I ended up working for him. And ever since then, I've been doing Homeland Security and Homeland Security policy. So I always like to share that, especially with audiences that might be younger in their career, because we often think that you have to plan everything out and you have a vision for what you're going to accomplish,
Yeah.
and sometimes you just work really hard and take advantage of the opportunities that open up to you. And that really was my story when it came to security. So I worked at the White House until about 2006, and then did some other work with our state and local partners on Homeland Security. Came back, worked in the Office of Director of National Intelligence. I was a contractor, but I was in the ODNI for some of the Obama years, and then
Hmm.
got married, had my son, and decided to take about an 18-month pause. And around then, my husband's job moved us. So we ended up living in several states over the course of about 6 years. So let me flash forward to the crux of your question. How do you end up in the Trump administration? I'm living in Dallas. I've got two kids, and I'm working full time as a consultant,
Hmm.
which means I'm juggling a lot and barely paying attention to the 2016 election, which is kind of funny considering my political background. But I was at this point very focused on security and my field. Um, when Trump was nominated, my husband and I were really disappointed. We had supported other parts of the Republican Party, really in that mode of like, what has happened? What does this represent? Trying to wrap your
Hmm.
arms around how we went from the party of George W. Bush compassionate conservatism to what you were seeing in Trump.
Yeah.
Um, and really wrestled with who to vote for. My husband chose to write in candidates, and I I've written about this since, but I kind of held my nose and voted for him, a decision I have come to regret. But the election happens, he wins, like we were all shocked,
Hmm.
and I get a phone call like within 48 hours. Hey, do you want to come in? Nope, not interested. Like
Hmm.
didn't even have to talk to my husband. I'm like, this is not my cup of tea. I'm not coming. Then a month went by and somebody called again and was like, seriously, you need to consider coming in. We're looking for people that have security experience. And I'm like, look, no, my kids are young. I don't want to uproot my family again.
Yeah.
This is not my team, not my fight. Then I got a call almost a year ago today, or sorry, 4 years ago today. When we're speaking, it was the week of inauguration, and my friend was explaining the chaos that she was enduring in the middle of transition, and how so few people actually had any sort of security qualifications to be taking on the positions that they were, and that she was very concerned for
Hmm.
our country.
Hmm.
And that changed it for me. It was no longer about politics or what kind of position you can have, as much as it was the country is not possibly going to be at risk because of the way that this man leads, because the
Hmm.
chaos that he brings along with him and all of the infighting.
Hmm.
So took some time, prayed with my husband, fought with my husband, and we have
That's like a tough decision.
yeah, it was a challenging time in our marriage, to be sure, and we decided to do it. And I guess the rest is history. I don't regret the decision. I regret voting for him. I don't
Hmm.
regret the decision coming in, because I do believe um, that there was a reason for me to be there, and we may talk about some of them today. But I completely understand the righteous, completely justified anger around many of the bad decisions that this administration has made.
Hmm.
And I can appreciate why it may seem like the right answer would be to walk away when some of those decisions were made. When you're in the security world, you it's almost divorced from politics. What you are viewing is how do you protect your country, and you swear an oath to the Constitution. You don't swear an oath
Hmm.
to a president or to an agency or a cabinet member. You're swearing an oath to the Constitution, and you're constantly asking yourself, what's the best thing for the country? And history will judge whether the right thing was to stay in or to leave, in
Hmm.
protest. But for many that were there, many of whom, will never be known. Like they're not public, they're not out there talking like I have been about the experience. But there are many that served because they love their country, because they were concerned for their country, and they were able to keep things somewhat steady within certain boundaries here. And
Yeah.
and they were they're in my view they're patriots. They kept us safe, not as safe as I wish we could have. There's no doubt, and a lot of damage that needs to be repaired.
Yeah, so I think that's the thing. We can't walk away because we're left with the mess of the last 4 years. Um, I'm curious to understand kind of where you're at when you voted for Trump. How did you justify it?
Mm.
Uh, Not to get too far off track from the conversation, but then I want to talk about at what point did you realize I need to speak out and say something about this as a part of the administration and step down. So I just kind of want to maybe talk and review that journey briefly.
Sure.
Hey, 2016 election, politically across the aisle, maybe you didn't identify with some of the things that Hillary Clinton was running on. But I think when a lot of people consider like the demographics of the people who voted for Trump, one surprising demographic to me was that a majority of white women voted for Trump when you had a white woman running for president. And obviously, there's something to be said about the historical implications and political implications. Obviously, different political parties, different ideologies. But even from a national security perspective, in the way that Trump obviously lacked certain qualifications to run the country at that level. Where were you at? How did you regret the decision now,
Yeah.
but at the time, how did you justify it?
Um, well, I'm going to try to pull some threads there, but wrestling is not even a strong enough word to describe the what trying to decide what to do with my vote would
Hmm.
represent. And but let's piece some of these out. One, I've really come to understand, especially in the last 6 months, as I've started speaking out and
Hmm.
been trying to explain my own journey. It's forced me to go deeper and understand, why do I believe certain things? What in my background, or what was I exposed to? What did I believe to be true that led me to these
Hmm.
conclusions? And certainly a product of growing up in Texas, in a conservative bubble, if you will,
Yeah.
upper middle class upbringing. Went to a private school, went to the University of Texas at Austin, worked in a Republican administration, worked in the
Hmm.
security field. I've traveled. I've done missionary work. I'm very involved in my church.
Hmm.
So those are all kind of factors that have influenced my thinking over time.
Hmm.
And one of the things that certainly was contributing to my worldview in 2016 was this idea that um, I think it's so funny looking back, because in 2020 it was so obvious
Yeah.
how hyperbolized so much of our political rhetoric was. But
Hmm.
I was not, I was not, I was consuming at a surface level. Maybe that's the best way to explain it. Focusing on like young kids, trying to get food on the table every night and trying
I
to
mean, yeah, you're
bring,
trying to live life. I mean,
yeah,
it's
bring,
tough to really do a deep dive and get
exactly.
into these decisions.
So
For sure.
when you're consuming at that surface level, you're hearing things like, well, if you vote for the Democrats, it wasn't so much about Hillary Clinton as it was,
Hmm.
broad brushstroke.
Hmm.
Democrats represent things that were antithetical to my values.
Hmm.
So I am pro life.
Hmm.
Now, what's interesting is I'm still pro-life, but my viewpoints about what that should look like in the
Hmm.
public space and what the government should do versus what you should advocate for and champion through other means have changed over the last 4 years. But in
Hmm.
2016, it was just a very traditional you vote based on who is going to put the right judges on courts. The Supreme Court was a big issue. Another topic would be Israel.
Hmm.
How, which party is going to be pro democracy and stand up to Iran and make sure that Israel is supported. Now, I say this, and even as I'm saying it, I'm these are very, very common themes in Republican circles, but
Hmm.
I almost bristle at remembering them because they are so broad brushstroke, watered down, not actually getting to root issues
Hmm.
when we talk about uh, you know, this is not to say that there aren't extreme views on the left either, but we just tend to overly polarize our whoever our opponent is, and
Hmm.
we've become very tribal. I want my team to win, and so
Most
you can
definitely.
appreciate this in the football world, right? Like
Absolutely. It's us versus them.
we have just taken politics and it's no longer about civic dialogue, and it's very much about I want my team to win, and I will do
Hmm.
just about anything to make sure that my team wins,
Hmm.
including painting with overly broad brushstrokes.
Hmm.
And I really kind of was in that echo chamber where it was, there really was no other choice other than to write in a candidate, and that didn't really matter because they would not have been elected. So I really struggled. I was really hoping that, especially after his atrocious comments in early October of 2016, that somebody would pull the plug and they'd scramble and put some other candidate up there. But they didn't.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's where I ended up. I literally, I think if I had gone to the voting booth maybe on a different day, I might have made a different decision. It
Yeah.
was that, back and forth for me. But my journey since then has been one of being repulsed.
Hmm.
I think part of my 2016 experience, I really didn't know him other than The Apprentice. And I wasn't impressed with him on the campaign trail, but I wasn't immersed in all of what I think now we know a lot more about his experience
Hmm.
in New York, his manipulation, his bankruptcies, his pattern and practice of bullying. And I just, I'd seen a little bit on the surface, but
Hmm.
I just didn't know all of that. And so getting into the administration in 2017 and seeing it up close, with your boss, and then kind of taking a standout view and being like, oh, this is how he
Yeah.
always has been. And of course, you meet people
Hmm.
from New York and they're like, yeah, how did you miss this? I'm like, I'm from Texas. I'm not from New York.
Yeah.
That's how
Yeah.
I
For
missed
sure.
it. But yeah, I mean, it just, I think it started quickly, or it started with this realization, and I know many people that came in and that we just naively assumed, well, he's going to walk into the Oval Office and like he'll understand the weight of this, that this isn't just
Yeah.
a game about building a building. Like this is a really
Hmm.
big deal, and he will be sober minded and he will listen and learn.
Hmm.
That lasted for like 4 or 5 months where
Hmm.
everybody was operating under these assumptions of like, okay, we're going to educate
It's
him
like,
on
yeah, looking at her, it's
yeah.
about time now. Yeah, let's.
And that was also about when you started to see him really like push off anybody trying to what he perceived to be control. I think most of the generals, the adults in the room were viewing this as like, we're trying to help you be successful in your
Hmm.
role. And he very much viewed it as like, you're trying to control me and you're trying to make me not be who I am. And
Hmm.
so that the tension, you really started to see the tension build with his team in that early summer period where Mattis or Tillerson or Kelly were trying very hard, and they were getting frustrated. Everybody was getting frustrated in that time period, and I remember there were rumors about 25th Amendment conversations in like that May June
Even then.
2019 timeframe. Yes, because I
Okay.
think that was the moment when people were like, It was also when he was talking about or went ahead and fired Jim Comey. But there was just this realization like he's not rising to the occasion. He does not know how to do
Yeah.
this job.
Yeah, so I think it's important. So let's trace back. I think it's important because we talk about, or you, from our previous conversation earlier this week, the idea of empathy,
Mm.
and coming from a place of understanding, even with opposing views. Something that I strongly believe in, and it's the reason why we have conversations like this on Making America. Your experience and perspective is what informed your decision to vote for who you voted for.
Mm.
Since then, obviously, you've had a different set of experiences outside and inside of the administration, seeing firsthand. And to me, that's at the foundation. It's an educational issue, a lack of information,
Mm.
not being able to have a full picture. You're focused on your family. You see what you see on the media, on every platform that paints in broad strokes. And now we're at a place where it's like, oh no, this guy isn't who everyone thought he could be or would be.
Right.
But it's too late. He's the president. What are we gonna do? 25th Amendment. When has that ever been used before? What does that left? What does that leave us with? And I think when you look at the chaos that you mentioned, the revolving door of critical cabinet agencies, we're left with a big mess. So we started from, hey, I voted for him regretfully in this present moment. Now, at what point explicitly did you decide? Obviously, you had a conversation with your husband, the security implications, safety for your family. But at what point did you say, "Hey, this is the last straw. I need to find a way out of this because this isn't right"?
Yeah, the decision to leave the administration was in the summer of 2019. It took a while to execute on that decision.
Mm-hmm.
I was responsible for 8 teams, and there were some.
Some critical infrastructure, like the
Yeah,
important
yeah.
stuff you're in control of.
So it took a while to execute on the decision, but it was this summer of 2019. My husband and I had been saying it's time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you've done what you can.
Mm-hmm.
Just prior to us having those conversations, Kirsten Nielsen had been fired. There had already been conversations of anybody that worked for Kelly, and Kirsten Kelly was the first Secretary of Homeland Security. Anybody that worked for them were viewed as not sufficiently loyal to Trump, which was true in my case.
Loyalty, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, they could care less about your security credentials. They could care less that, many of us were like, I'm not here for Trump, but I'm here for
You're
my.
serving a critical function of the
Yeah.
country. Yeah.
But they weren't interested in that. So
Mm-hmm.
it was a combination of recognizing the environment was changing pretty quickly. They were installing more people that aligned with Stephen Miller's viewpoint. They were, starting to push back on things that in the past we had some leeway to do what we thought was the best thing from a security perspective. But probably the most pivotal moment was the attack on El Paso by a white supremacist who believed that he believed a lot of things, but his
Yeah.
manifesto explicitly referenced things like the Great Replacement theory and words that had been used by the president in his campaign speeches, by his
Mm-hmm.
campaign and internet memes, Hispanic invasion. And so he drives, I think it's like 10 to 12 hours from North Texas to El Paso, Texas, because he believes that he'll find more Hispanics there
Yeah.
in order to specifically target Hispanics and kill them.
Mm-hmm.
It's devastating. And it should have been devastating earlier. Like we had an attack in October of 2018 at a
Mm-hmm.
synagogue. And that was also kind of a Great Replacement theory type of manifesto. But in some ways, I think when you see communities that are historically targeted, and the Jewish community has been sadly dealing with hate crimes for years, much
Mm-hmm.
like the Black community has.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easier for the security community to go, well, that is a racist person, an individual, a lone wolf, and they kind of put it in this category of horrible. We need to help make sure that Black churches and synagogues are hardened and protected, and they do
Hmm.
training from shooter drills, that kind of thing. So it's not like the security community doesn't care, but they don't necessarily see it in this broader context,
Hmm.
that this is a movement, and that
Yeah, it's a result of a systemic
exactly.
issue. Yes.
Yes. Something about the El Paso thing, if you might remember that we also had the attack in Christchurch in March
Oh,
of
yep, yep.
2019. So it was before El Paso, but after the synagogue shooting. And the Christchurch attack of mosques in New Zealand
Hmm.
was another moment where the security community was like, what is going on? Like we've never seen a white person go do something so devastating to the Muslim community. It was a very, it didn't fit the mold of what people think of when they think of white people going to commit an attack.
Hmm.
But then when you scan out and you look at the data here is really stunning and so sad that I didn't see this until 2019 and started asking questions. Meaning,
Yeah.
the security community should have been raising the alarm much sooner than these attacks, which then forced us to scan out and go, what's going on? But here's the data. In the last 10
Hmm.
years, 76% of all extremist related murders, meaning anybody that associates with an extreme ideology, 76% come from what is considered a right wing extremist ideology. So that could be
Hmm.
the preponderance of that is white supremacist. But
Hmm.
there's also an anti government extremist. And when I use that term, I'm thinking like militias or um, Proud Boys might be considered anti-government extremists. Boogaloo Boys, anti-government extremist in the sense
Hmm.
that they want a civil war, but they not Antifa. Right, Antifa would be considered a left-wing extremist, and by the way, they're not
Hmm.
really an organization, but the label
Yeah.
of Antifa is a left-wing thing. So 70
Marketing is powerful.
exactly.
Disinformation, which we'll talk about later. Yeah.
So 76% are coming from the right. But why had we not seen that over a 10-year period? That's more than Islamic jihadist terrorism.
Hmm.
And certainly more than anything on the left. They're in the history of our country. There have been time periods when left wing terrorism has been more prevalent than right wing terrorism, but
Hmm.
for like the last 50 years, it's been the right wing terrorism. So when you
Yep.
scale out and you start looking at the data, you're like, oh my gosh, we have a really big problem in this country. Why are we
Hmm.
not talking about it? So the moments of Christchurch realizing this is global, this is not just here in the United States, then you have your foreign partners start coming to the table and saying, hey, you guys, you're exporting this. This is making my job over here in Europe, over here in Australia and New Zealand harder. Why
Hmm.
don't you get a grip on this growing right wing extremist problem that you have? I mean, it really started to compound in 2019 for us. So we turned to the White House after El Paso. They finally realized, at a minimum, oh, we have a political problem on our hands. We need to seem like we're doing something. I think there were genuinely a few people that were really concerned, but by and large, this White House viewed things through optics. And okay,
Yeah.
we have a problem on our hands. What do we do? And it gave us the opportunity to brief on a couple of programs that we were championing. We were looking forward to, making some. We were able to make some progress based on those conversations. So it wasn't like nothing good came of this. But the big thing that we really needed the White House and the president to acknowledge, usually what you do when you have a new threat is you define the enemy and you explain to the American people, this is who the enemy is. And
Hmm.
you remember these moments, even if you were young post 9/11, you probably have seen the videos of the president of the United States addressing the American people immediately after 9/11, or
Hmm.
addressing the Congress and laying out the plan for how we were going to go after Al Qaeda, right? Like that is what leadership looks like. We're used to
Hmm.
our leader telling us this is our enemy, and we are going to do everything in our power to make sure that this enemy is held accountable and cannot come and attack us again. That's what we're
Yeah.
used to. But they
For sure.
refused to do that, take on that role. They did not want to talk about this as domestic terrorism. They wanted to talk about it in terms of violence. That yes, we have a violence problem in our country.
Hmm.
We do, but they weren't interested in talking about anybody that, and I've come to believe that a lot of this has to be do with the fact that these folks on the right are the president's supporters, and he likes to be loyal. Who's loyal to him, so
Yep.
even though they will kill people. Like, oh, you voted for me? Great. I mean, that was kind of the unspoken tension there, and that was the moment when
Yeah.
I was like, I've had enough. I need to get out.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on a lot there. There's some important distinctions to be made, right? You look at the criminalization of Black and Brown people in our country, and that was very easy to do when you look at post 9/11, the criminalization of Muslim people. What does Al Qaeda look like? Let's ban people from these Muslim countries. That's how he justified some of his policies. And then you look at right wing extremist terrorism. Well, what do these people look like? Well, they look like white people in this country, and it's difficult to discern. It's difficult to point a finger at, hey, you're a right wing extremist when that person looks like you. I think that's definitely a part of the issue. So when you recognize this, you decided, hey, I'm going to step down. Looking back on everything that you've experienced and everything that we've all experienced over the last 4 years, what could you say that we learned? Um, you touched on disinformation in our previous conversation. Obviously, that's a huge topic. I'd love your perspective as a security expert in what that means for national security and how we address that moving forward, if you don't mind.
Yeah, good question. I think at least one of my big takeaways looking back over 4 years, there's the old adage or the quote that came, I want to say from Bonhoeffer during World War II, that all it takes for evil to be successful is for good men to stand by and say nothing. I'm botching that quote, but this idea that complicity or silence, um, you know, silence is complicity. That
Hmm.
we, by not, drawing line and saying this is the point of integrity. This is the point at which I will not stand with you. Um, we the slippery slope effect, and psychologists have studied this, right? Like you put people in groups, they come into a room with a certain opinion about some topic. And if you put them in the room with other people that have the same opinion and you put them on a scale of 1 to 10, they hold a 5 in terms of
Hmm.
intensity of that viewpoint. And everybody else in that room has a 5. Everybody that walks out of that room after, an hour conversation is going to walk out as a 7 or an 8. They intensify based on just talking to each other because there's no alternative perspectives that have
Hmm.
inserted in there. And it's similar when you with from an ethics perspective when you first come in to a group. If a group has a certain ethic,
Hmm.
and your ethic is higher, but you come into this group initially you're shocked, but then you to adjust you go along with it, and then 6 months go by and you're like, well, this seems completely normal. There is a tendency to decline if we are not constantly vigilant in holding up our ethic and holding up our integrity and saying that character matters. And I think the last 4 to 6 years is this grand experiment of this: what happens when good people
Hmm.
are fearful, maybe justifiably fearful of,
Hmm.
if I speak out, then I could get fired, or I'm going to get tweeted at and lose my job as a senator or
Hmm.
congressman, or made fun of. And and that there was always this stance. He would cross a line. People would be like, "Hey, that was too much," and then we would go back to some sort of stasis, and then he would cross the line even further the next time. Hey, that was too much. And but nobody ever punishes him. There is no accountability until hopefully this moment that we're presently in, where the Senate may vote to convict him,
Hmm.
and remove him from ever being able to hold office again. But like, how did we end up 4 years down the road with all of these broken norms, all of this broken character,
Yeah.
incompetence to carry out his duties? And it's because Republicans were scared of him.
Hmm.
And, so you see a lot of people soul searching on like, what do we do with the Republican Party? To me, it's, sure, it was the Republican Party here that really fell down on the job of leading and showing character integrity. But
Hmm.
it's probably also societal. There's so many factors that led us to this point. I really hope that the entirety of good men and women, willing men and women look at uh, that we pause and that we're introspective a bit on
Hmm.
how did we allow this to happen. And I want to be really clear because there are plenty of people that spoke out and raised the alarms and have been doing that for like 6 years, and God bless those people. And I am sorry that it took me so long to see it. But there were a lot of us that ignored it, a lot of us that were like, I think we can survive and it's not a big deal.
Hmm.
But like, man, character really does matter. And that was
Yeah.
that I wrote about this during the campaign. And the reason I decided to speak out is because I felt like the only way that the American people are ever going to have the opportunity to make the right choices if people actually tell the truth about what we saw. There were so many people covering for him, so many adults in the room that I'm grateful that they were there for the preponderance of the tenure of his term. But man, we needed more of them to speak out about how much they had to do every single day to keep him from disaster. Because
Yeah.
that's what the American people should vote on, is the truth that he was a horrible, manager. He was chaotic. He was undisciplined. Yeah, you wanted your policies, you wanted your platform, but this man was
Hmm.
incompetent and he lacked character. And I came to this realization that we always assumed that the people we vote into office are mildly competent and they can surround themselves with competent people, but they
Hmm.
had character enough to be able to be on that stage. And here was somebody
Hmm.
that lacked both. And his answer to that was not to surround himself with people of character and competence and listen to it. His answer was, to ignore anybody of character and competence and to be all about himself, which meant that even though he had some supposed policy successes, um, he more often than not tripped all over those policy efforts because he lacked competence and character. So,
Yeah, no, I think you're speaking to a lot of things that are important to discuss. But getting back to disinformation,
yeah,
and I want to clarify the difference between disinformation versus misinformation is that disinformation is intentional. There's an intention behind spreading things that aren't true. And when you look at the way he presented his thoughts and ideas and how he opposed those who were in contrast, or that opposed him, you see these fake news. The culture shifted when you look at fact checking as a business exploded over the last 4 years because it's important for people to have access to the truth, which is what you should be voting on. But when you bend the lines and you kind of or blur the lines and what's real, what's not, and then he's able to develop this loyal following. I think from a national security standpoint, this idea of disinformation, lying to the public to get them to do things in your interests. I think we see and we know that everything about this administration was self-serving. It wasn't to the benefit of the American people or to our country's national security. It was for the people in the administration. And then you have a few select individuals like yourself who are considering the big picture now at this point. You know, but even throughout that time and getting to the next point, you see a lot of turnover. And you spoke to this on our previous phone call, the importance of institutional stability. How can you have national security when you don't have the expertise and the experience that comes with being in a position for an extended period of time, or at least even in the industry for an extended period of time? You talk about when you first came onto the administration, you got a call the first time, second time, third time. It's like, hey, we got a problem here. Our country isn't safe. We need someone that knows what they're doing. Can you speak to that a bit?
sure. I mean, look, it's not very exciting. Government work is often,
As it shouldn't be
I know
exciting. If
it
it were
really
exciting, it
should.
would be an
Let's get
issue,
over
right?
boring again. It's great. Um, there's a lot to pick apart in government bureaucracy. A lot that it should be more agile and be more responsive to the American people. But a lot of those norms, a lot of those processes are put in place as checks and balances to make sure that nobody abuses the system, or
Hmm.
that the people, through commenting and public review processes, have the opportunity to weigh in on things like regulations or legislation being made.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of parts of our government that aren't very exciting, but the process is there to, in effect, to protect against abuses. And what we
Hmm.
saw in the Trump administration was a combination of incompetence, people coming in from outside of government. And of course, I mean, this happened in Obama. You bring
Hmm.
people from outside of government, they come in. But what's different is that in Obama, people are turning to seasoned people that have been in government and say, how do you do this? And
Hmm.
you always notice, like, an adjustment period of
So there's
about
a certain
6 months.
humility. It's like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. Let's ask someone who does
Yeah,
know
like,
what they're
how do we,
doing.
we want to do affect this policy. What do we do? What is it, an
Hmm.
executive order? Is it a presidential directive? No, you got to go to Congress. Oh, okay. So how do you do that?
Hmm.
Like, just basics of how do you make things work. So you always usually bring in, with any team, people with that kind of experience.
Hmm.
In Trump world, they one of the first things you saw after he won the election is that he took the person that was responsible for building his transition team, Chris Christie.
Hmm.
And Chris Christie, having been a governor, kind of knows how government works. They took his transition plan, threw it in the trash, pushed him out, and put
Hmm.
Jared Kushner in charge, who, is a relatively young guy and
Hmm.
certainly has never worked in government before. And that pattern you have seen play out multiple times, including in the COVID response,
Yep.
where seasoned people, like experts, scientists,
Yes.
doctors, are ignored for the sake of, well, I have this idea I want to try out. Now look, sometimes that innovation, when properly channeled, is a good thing for government. It's always good for
Fresh ideas,
yeah,
new ways of thinking. Yeah,
disruption is
absolutely.
is very valid, in especially in the tech world. Everybody loves disruption. Constant disruption, constant chaos, constant ignoring of norms leads to a
Hmm.
place where everybody's burned out. Nobody knows who's on first. Nobody, like, and then you end up with, like, what we saw on January 6th. The warning bells, like the intel people are saying something's happening,
Hmm.
but nobody steps up and said, hey, we should do something about this. Now,
Yep.
the Capitol Police are primarily responsible because of the way, I mean, it's a separation of powers issue, legislative
Hmm.
branch. They are responsible for security of the Capitol.
Yep.
I guarantee you, if any of our first three secretaries, first four secretaries, or their immediate staff had been on the watch uh, leading up to January 6th, you would have seen a
Hmm.
very different set of actions coming out of the executive branch. Because yes, there's separation of powers, but if there is an emergency or an impending threat, you figure out how to warn
Yeah.
and how to be prepared. You don't say, "Oh, I don't know whose job it is." So I'm just,
Well, and to that point, you look at who Trump had on his administration. You mentioned it before. It was loyalty over everything. It was self-serving.
yes,
So, when Trump, doesn't win the election, he kind of knows he doesn't have a good chance of winning the election leading up to the election. He claims fake news. Hey, if I didn't win it, it's rigged. And then you have him inciting the mob and the people who he put in control. They lack the experience. I would imagine that there was some intention there, right? This
absolutely.
disinformation, it was intentional, right? There was nothing there. We know that it was intentional. This isn't a surprise. It wasn't a secret. Yeah, it was a lapse. But who created the lapse? Intentional decisions to put people that are loyal to you to ensure, or try to gain whatever power you're seeking to hold or maintain. And I think that gets to one of my points below. I know we're running out of time here, but there's a clear power struggle
Yeah,
in our country. And you mentioned some of these theories earlier, this idea of this kind of great replacement theory.
mm,
And the reality is, a lot of these conspiracies are founded in truth and facts. The demographics of our country are changing.
mm.
And when you look at the previous election and some of the states that turned blue, you look at Georgia, you look at Arizona, the changing demographics. There are people that have been disenfranchised, different laws, literacy tests, et cetera, to turn people away from the polls, particularly Black people, brown people, people of color, marginalized communities that are now engaged and active. You see what's happened in this previous election, and obviously there's other factors that go into that. But there's a real struggle for power, and then we see exactly what people are willing to do to maintain that on the January 6th kind of insurrection attempt to overturn the is it validation of the votes or certify
Or, yeah,
the votes, the electoral college votes. Yeah. So what does that look like? So we talked about 50 million people believe the election was
the big
rigged.
lie.
Yeah, that's an issue from a national security perspective. You talked
It
about that. Could
is.
you touch on that briefly?
Yes. So there's two issues. One, in 2016, we'll go back to your disinformation point. In 2016, the disinformation was coming from foreign nations. It was coming primarily from Russia and a handful of others. And we weren't prepared for it. And the analysts never assessed that it changed the outcome of the election. But, I'm not sure that we'll ever truly know. It's really hard to that's more of a qualitative assessment than anything we can do quantitatively. 2020, the disinformation was not coming from hostile nation states. It was coming from the inside. And as early as the summer, you saw the president start to sow the seeds, lay the groundwork for what I now think is arguably a premeditated plan to claim that the election was stolen. Now, I think his advisors were very clear with him. You're probably not going to win this election for all of these factors. COVID being, probably a very strong one.
A big one, yeah.
But a lot of other things. His mismanagement of COVID has a lot to do with it. And so they started doing things like questioning mail-in voting and looking for legally appropriate changes to the law to take into account the pandemic, and they were calling them into question. And they even used the civil unrest associated with the George Floyd protests to paint this broad brushstroke of, we need law and order, and if you don't vote for a Republican, then Antifa is going to take over all your cities. And the irony behind this, drove me nuts as a security professional, is that there were no facts to back that argument up. Antifa was not in, they've done maps now, and they'll show you, up in Pacific Northwest, you have some left-wing movements that showed up in those protests. Everything else is right-wing. The murders, the incitement of riots, it was
the threats,
the Blue Boys, I'm not saying that Antifa can't cause problems. That's not it. It's just that it's not a national security issue. It's not something the President of the United States needs to be talking about. Do you know what he should talk about? He should talk about the people that have conducted 76% of all murders and extremist murders in the last 10 years. That would be the white supremacists and the anti-government extremists on the right. But he refused to do that. So the disinformation about Antifa, the disinformation about the election being stolen, all leads up to this moment where they're encouraging people, you need to show up to the polling places because we think Antifa is going to, maybe prevent people from voting, or we need the militia to make sure that your votes are counted because we think fraud's going to happen. Planted those seeds. Then we have this election count, which went long, and everybody warned them, at least on the mainstream media, they warned them that the counting would go long because of the pandemic and the mail-in ballots, and some of the laws wouldn't allow them to count in advance. Nonetheless, that gave them the time to start to weave these stories. And it was, it's kind of when we go back and we see this painted out, you could not, if you were Russia, you could not have designed this any better to achieve your aims of complete societal discord and polarization. But flash forward to December, and I think, for whatever reason, Trump seemed to genuinely believe that maybe his court cases would win. He's starting to realize there's probably not a lot of hope, but he keeps buying into these conspiracies himself. And you see the rhetoric change. We've had analysts talk about the rhetoric changing in mid-December, and all of the folks around the president, the Steve Bannons, the Roger Stones, the right-wing media echo chamber, they all started to use similar language that was very obviously pointing towards force. We got to take back our country by force. This is a revolution. This is our 1776 moment. So when you had like the language change, the chatter online is changing, and it leads us to this January 6th moment. Um, and certainly the storming of the Capitol for some that were Trump supporters, that was a bridge too far, and
Mm-hmm.
it forced them to go, "Ooh, like that's not what I was about." I don't know what I wanted Trump to do. I just wanted him to win. I'm really scared of Joe Biden being my president for a bunch of lies that I've been fed, but I didn't want violence. But there's still a sizable portion. It's remarkable when you're reading these indictments of the people that stormed the Capitol, had their videos on, posting on social media. Some were
Yep.
smart enough to pull it down, realizing like, oh, they're going to find and arrest me. But a lot of them are like, but I did nothing wrong. I was
Yep. And
defending my, like, this
to
is
your
a logical conclusion for them,
yeah,
not
so
something
I
they're
think
ashamed of.
to this point of a power struggle and the ideas of white supremacy when they're saying our country, this is,
Mm-hmm.
we need to take back, there's this possession, right?
Yes.
This is our place. This is, we do things the way we want to do things here. And that was very clearly evident in the confidence and, to your point, the fact that a lot of people felt that they did nothing wrong. It was within their right to fight for what they believed in, some glorification of 1776. And then we come to find out, a lot of people weren't really about that life. But then a lot of people were. And I think, with all of everything that's gone on over the last couple of weeks and the last 4 years, the next question to ask is how do we move forward? You mentioned impeachment. You mentioned in our previous talk kind of the de-radicalization
Mm-hmm.
of this right wing portion of the GOP. What does that look like in your opinion?
Short term, we in the immediate need to secure the inauguration. I'm pleased with what we're seeing out of law enforcement. I think they're
Mm-hmm.
taking the threat much more seriously. Should have done it in the first place, but they seem to be on the ball now.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing some fracturing of the various extremist coalitions, so that's good news. We want to try to take advantage of that.
Yep.
And you're seeing a small part of what I call Trump world or MAGA world, the people that were not necessarily associated with an extremist group,
Mm-hmm.
but are very Trump focused. And maybe QAnon, you kind of put them in this group. They are starting to realize that all of these theories they had of how Trump was going to still become president are probably not happening. So over the next few days, we have some volatile periods where people become disenchanted from what they have been buying into, and that creates opportunity um, for us to help them de-radicalize. It also creates opportunity for the extremists to recruit them into something darker. And I'm really
Mm-hmm.
worried about that because the extremists realize it. They're on in their chat rooms. They're giving each other tips about how to
Yeah,
recruit.
you're very vulnerable when your
Yeah,
reality comes crashing down.
exactly.
Yep.
So if anybody's listening that has a friend that was in QAnon or was a big Trump supporter, and they're disheartened because of what has happened,
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage you. I'm not saying you have to be a trained psychologist or anything. There's a lot of mess here to piece through, but loving them, being empathetic to them, if you have a personal relationship with them, that goes a long way to invite them back into reality. I'm not saying you have to deprogram them at all, but it is really amazing how simple acts of loving somebody and giving them grace, even if they've been even if eventually their actions, they need to be held accountable for them. The best thing we could all do right now is shrink the number of radicalized people. When the most recent polls indicate that 50 million people in the country still believe that the election was stolen. That is way too many people for law enforcement to have to worry about. And not all 50 million would go out and conduct an act of violence, but when you believe that the election is stolen, that the whole premise of our constitutional country has broken,
Mm-hmm.
it does create a justification. It becomes logical that violence might be your only recourse. So I'm very passionate about trying to encourage anybody with the platform to tell the truth. The election was not stolen. This is really
Mm-hmm.
important for Republicans to say. It's really important for Trump supporters, people that were advocating for him in this past election, for them to come out and say the election wasn't stolen.
Yep.
Here are the facts, and there are any number of fact check sites out there that you could use. but gently encouraging people to come back to reality. That shrinks that pool that we have to worry about, and it allows law enforcement to be able to grapple with the true extremists, the true radicalized individuals. But I really think we're going to be dealing with this from a generational for generations.
Most, and we have been. The reality
No,
is we
that's
have
true.
been.
That's
Yep.
true.
Yep.
So let me rephrase that. The white power movement that we've been dealing with obviously has its roots in the founding of our country, but the
Mm-hmm.
way that it currently operates.
Yeah. It's been revitalized over the last 4 years. People have been
Yes,
emboldened. We've
exactly.
seen.
So
Yep.
they've
Yep.
been around since the 80s, but they have expanded. They feel empowered right now. And so that aspect of it, I think we'll be
Mm-hmm.
dealing with for the next generation.
Most
Yeah.
definitely. I think that's a good place to end our conversation. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I don't want to hold you too long. I really want to retouch, your kind of talk of empathy and coming from a place of understanding. I think even when you have opposing views, the best way to convince someone or enlighten someone is to understand exactly where they're coming from. How did they get to this place where their views are in such opposition to yours, so much so that they may be harmful to a portion of the population and really the state of our country and the national security. I think I just want to end on this. It's clear that the damage done isn't irreversible, but I think it really increases the urgency of kind of the task at hand and what we need to be addressing to move forward as a country and to hold our country up to its principles, and make sure that those are applied to all of its citizens. When you look at the freedoms and things that we're all afforded. Any final thoughts,
Well, I
Elizabeth?
think, Josh, what you're doing the Making America series, having these conversations is contributing to that repair work. It's contributing to giving people the opportunity to hear different perspectives, and to be more tolerant of other viewpoints. And that is so important as we try to welcome people who, again, I want to be clear, I'm a strong believer in accountability before you can uh, have reconciliation. But
Mhm.
we're not going to get to accountability and reconciliation if we just yell at people. So doing the work you're doing is really awesome. We need more of it in our society. So thank you for your leadership.
Hey, I appreciate that, Elizabeth. That's what we're all about at Making America is, trying to come to an understanding, but in a way that's productive and kind of moves us forward as a whole. You look at, Republican versus Democrat. We're all in the same country. We all have to live in the same, borders and boundaries together. So I think it's best that we act accordingly. But I want to thank you again for your time, Elizabeth. Everyone, this is Elizabeth Neumann, security expert, former Trump administration staffer. Anything else I could add to your title? Where can people find you? They can follow you on Twitter,
Yes.
New Summits. We'll include all the links and things in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
description of the show.
Follow me on Twitter at New Summits. And if you're at all interested in the Republican Accountability Project, you can look at Accountable GOP on Twitter, and trying to make sure that accountability does happen. That's an important part of the reconciliation process.
Absolutely, and that's New NEU
Yes.
Summits
Yes. We'll play
Twitter.
on the
So
word new.
thank you so much, Elizabeth. I really enjoyed our conversation. Excited to get this out there to the masses.
Thanks, Josh. Have a
All
great week. Happy Inauguration Day.
right. Happy Inauguration Day. Take care.